York City, a young woman disappears.
Nobody ever saw my sister.
There was no evidence of foul play.
Was she suicidal, as her husband claims? Or did it have something to do with her extramarital affairs?
The cops were looking at both her current lover and her ex-lover.
She was too intimidated to tell them really what was happening for fear of retribution.
Her family has no doubt. She's been murdered.
It was so clear my sister is dead.
The medical examiner said that you could cut up a body like a chef could cut up a chicken.
In-depth, insightful, in a class of its own. It's America's leading journal, Vanity Fair. Writer Lisa DiPaolo investigates intimations of murder. July 8th, 1985. The end of a long July 4th weekend. At 9:20 that night, Robert Birnbaum, a 29-year-old surgical resident, walks into the local police station. He's there because his wife, Gail Katz Birnbaum, a graduate student studying for her doctorate in psychology, is missing.
The police found out about Gail Katz's disappearance when Robert Birnbaum went to the 19th precinct and filed what's called a UF-61. It's commonly referred to as a complaint report. And it was 36 to 40 hours after she left the apartment after an argument.
He said they had a bad fight and that Gail left. He told them she was going to Central Park to chill out.
He eventually left the apartment, went to his sister's house, attended his nephew's birthday party, then went to West Orange, New Jersey, to the home of a friend of his, and then returned home that evening.
Bob called me that night and asked if Gail was with me. Have you seen Gail? Is she with you? She never came home.
Bob Birnbaum calls his mother-in-law, but she hasn't heard from Gail either. Everyone is wondering, where could Gail have gone? Manhattan's Upper East Side seems far removed from North Belmore, the middle-class Long Island town where Gail Katz grew up.
Through junior high and high school, we were very, very close friends. I would describe Gail as a very smart person with a very gentle way about her. She seemed to me very ethereal, very elegant.
She really saw the best in people, and even when she saw the worst in them, she assumed she could help them and even change them. Gail was always very popular. There was always a boyfriend. She did not lack for attention.
Gail was no wallflower. She had plenty of men before Bob, but they weren't nice Jewish doctors.
When friends introduced Gail Katz to Bob Birnbaum in 1982, he sweeps her off her feet.
They started dating, and everything was wonderful. Bob was a pilot. He was very romantic. I will never forget her telling me about the night that he flew her as the sun was setting over all of the bridges of Manhattan. That's quite a date.
He spoke 5 languages, had fancy cars, was a gourmet chef. a classical guitarist, and not bad looking.
He was studying to become a surgeon with the goal of becoming a plastic surgeon.
On August 29, 1982, Gail Katz marries the accomplished surgeon from the well-to-do family.
I thought he was a nice guy, Bob Birnbaum. She seemed to need security at the time, and I believe Bob fulfilled that for her. Security and financial comfort.
It's been 5 days, and Bob Birnbaum hasn't heard from his wife.
He actually went on one of the nightly news shows where he made an appeal to the general public.
New York City police tonight are looking for a Manhattan surgeon's wife, missing since last Sunday after a fight with her husband.
She's a graduate student in psychology, takes that very seriously, and has patient responsibilities, has patients who are dependent on her. And I think no matter, what, she wouldn't abandon her patients.
What do you think happened to your wife?
I don't know, but I'm worried.
Police go through Gail's address book and interview everyone who had seen her the previous week, including neighbors and staff at her 85th Street apartment building.
Nobody ever saw my sister, including the doorman.
There was security surveillance cameras in the building they lived in, but by the time the cops got to that, it was already taped over.
Bob and his family, and Gail and his friends and family began to plaster the walk from their apartment to Central Park and all of Central Park with posters.
We designed flyers with her picture, and we put them all over Manhattan.
There were a lot of sightings. People calling the cops saying, "We saw Gail, we saw Gail." She was sighted on the 7 train. And someone else said they thought they saw her in the Bronx.
Police follow up on every tip without success. But one lead does intrigue investigators.
Joel Davis contacted Missing Persons and said that I saw this woman alive in the company of another woman that Sunday at around 3 o'clock in a bagel store in the West 70s.
But that lead, like the others, goes nowhere. By now, Gail Birnbaum has been missing for over a week. Police decide to question her husband again.
I don't think they consider him a suspect, but you always look first to the partner, always.
This time, investigators press Bob Birnbaum about his marriage.
He admitted that they fought a lot.
The downstairs neighbor said that there was rarely a day that there wasn't some drama happening in the apartment above them.
You know, Bob was a medical resident. He worked his tail off, as all good medical residents do, and Gail felt a little neglected. He was an odd duck. His behavior was disturbing at times. He was very controlling, told her what to wear, got mad if she didn't wear the right thing.
She would go to turn on a light or turn off a light, and he would cover her hand, and he would do it for her. Everything was Bob's way.
There was a part of her that believed, like a lot of women believe, that he'll change.
I knew that part of her did love Bob, but their marriage became impossible. It became too suffocating for Gail.
During the marriage, there were 2 affairs. And I think the first affair was a flirtation.
I was aware that Gail was having an affair. When she disappeared, it was a very special relationship. I believe she was in love with this professor.
In fact, the day before she vanishes, Gail Katz-Birnbaum is looking for her own apartment.
The last time I saw Gail, we met at her hairdresser's. She had a New York Times residential section with her. She had some apartments circled, and she told me that she was thinking of leaving Bob.
She certainly, at that time, was closer than she ever was in terms of actually making plans to leave him.
Police confront Bob Birnbaum with his wife's infidelity. But he insists he knows nothing of her affairs. Did Gail abandon her husband for the new man in her life?
Turned out that, well, the boyfriend hadn't heard from her. And none of their family had heard from her. That's when it became pretty clear that she wasn't just missing.
It's been more than a week, and there's no sign of Gail Katz-Birnbaum. Her family and friends are desperate for answers.
Nobody's seen her. She hasn't called. They still held out hope.
She disappeared into thin air. But we had the hope in our hearts that maybe she took off, maybe she was missing, maybe she was alive. I'm very emotional right now.
Gail's husband, Bob Birnbaum, believes his wife may have taken her own life.
She struggled with depression. She was hospitalized twice for depression. So the suicide theory wasn't far-fetched. She did attempt suicide before. But, you know, to kill yourself and hide your own body is a pretty amazing feat.
And there is no evidence that Gail ran off with another man.
The cops were looking at both her current lover and her ex-lover. They'd be remiss if they didn't. But they both had very good alibis.
Investigators start to wonder if Bob Birnbaum, the young medical resident, has told them everything.
And what made them suspicious was the stories that her sister Elaine was telling them about this crazy marriage.
Elaine Katz says she will never forget one disturbing altercation a year after they married.
My sister's studying for her GREs, her graduate record exams, and she thinks Bob has left for the day to go to work. And she's nervous about her exams, so she smokes a cigarette.
Robert Birnbaum was avidly anti-smoking, rabidly really anti-smoking.
And while she's smoking the cigarette, Bob unexpectedly returns. And as she describes it, he literally, leaps over a couch, pounces on her, and starts strangling her. And although she says that he had put his hands on her neck before, it had never been to the point where she lost consciousness. And when she came to, he was on top of her sobbing and begging for forgiveness and swearing that it would never happen again.
doctor that she worked with actually saw the finger marks of the bruising to her neck.
Now, 4 days later, she filed a police report, but never followed up, never pursued it.
I'm just speculating that Gail was too intimidated at that moment to tell them really what was happening for fear of retribution from Bob.
The police didn't do anything with regards to her complaint. And all I can say is this was 1985. Police response in 1985 was, we have much more important things to do than chase after two people who are fighting.
She did move out. She lived with my grandfather in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn.
Bob promises he will change, and to prove it, he agrees to see a psychiatrist.
He courts her while she's living in Brooklyn. He does all the right things. Her husband is doing the, oh my God, I'm in therapy and I understand and I promise I'll never do it again. Gail doesn't want to fail at marriage, so it's not that hard to talk her into coming back.
But there's no indication that once Gail moved back in, and even with the therapy, that things got better for this couple.
The Katz family starts to believe that Bob Birnbaum is responsible for his wife's disappearance.
It was so clear. He was a volatile man. Bob was violent.
Gail's family and friends search the Birnbaum's Upper East Side apartment for evidence. One day, while Bob is at work, they uncover an unsettling clue.
She left her purse with her keys, her wallet, and her cigarettes. Nobody has a fight and leaves their purse with their cigarettes if they smoke.
There was no evidence of foul play. There was nobody, the DA's office, could articulate a poisonous marriage, but you're going nowhere with that to indict somebody.
The case goes cold. Then, in May 1989, 4 years after Gail disappeared, a gruesome discovery.
A torso, a female torso, floated up on Staten Island.
Could it be, after all these years, the body of Gail Katz Birnbaum? May 1989, a mutilated torso is found near a Staten Island pier. When they examine the remains, the coroner concludes it is the body of Gail Katz Birnbaum, who disappeared 4 years earlier.
This is before DNA. They noticed an abnormality on one of the ribs in the torso that identically matched Gail's corresponding rib in the X-ray. And the medical examiner's office certified the torso as being Gail Katz.
At least they had what was left of her body. And they could bury her.
That gave us some closure, and it was actually a good thing.
To Gail's friends and family, the condition of the body is more proof that her husband, Bob Birnbaum, the gifted surgeon, murdered her.
The body had been disarticulated. The arms and legs had been surgically removed at the shoulders and at the hips, and the head had been removed almost surgically as well. Of course, as a physician and as a surgeon, Robert Birnbaum had that knowledge.
But the torso alone is not sufficient evidence to get an indictment.
The determination was that it wasn't good enough for the standard of criminal law conviction. So again, we closed the door. I very vocally blamed him and accused him. And my sister is dead and her husband killed her. I sent letters to the secretaries and to the doctors that he worked with, and would send all of these press clippings also.
She would say, ask him what happened to his wife. Elaine Katz never let up. And let me tell you, if you're gonna be dismembered, she's the sister you want. But she was ruthless. If Bob Birnbaum was innocent, she was doing a really good job of ruining his life.
By the end of 1989, Birnbaum leaves the apartment he shared with Gail and moves west.
I heard that Bob had picked up roots and went to Las Vegas.
Vegas is one of those places that people go and they think they can just start a new life. Which he did. He becomes a successful plastic surgeon.
In the capital of glitter and glitz, Dr. Bob Birnbaum establishes a serious surgical practice.
How many boob jobs and nose jobs and facelifts must get done in Vegas on a regular basis? And yet that wasn't his specialty. He worked with people with deformities, children with hair lips.
Interestingly enough, he was a regular on these charity flights to places in Mexico to perform surgery pro bono on needy people.
This is a lot more primitive than what we have back in the States.
He was one of those doctors that went to poor villages and treated children with horrible defects.
It takes 45 minutes out of my life, and if I can do that a few times a year and make a change in somebody else's life, it's the least that I can do.
They call him Dr. Bob, a selfless and caring surgeon. There is no hint of the past scandal. Dr. Bob is the toast of the town.
Dr. Birnbaum was having a great time in Las Vegas. He was partying. He had a number of girlfriends.
So he was considered quite wonderful. And while he was in Vegas, he met his soon-to-be second wife, Janet, who was a gynecologist. And together they moved to North Dakota. His wife's brother lived there. He was pretty well respected. I mean, I think he was leading a, I would say, admirable life.
He was supposedly a pillar of the community. And I was appalled when I heard that they thought Bob was such a great guy.
The chief investigator in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, Andy Rosenzweig, always suspected that Bob Birnbaum was lying.
Rosenzweig said to me, I know that Bob did this murder, and I'm going to prove it before I retire.
This case bothered Andy for years. And he pulled it out again, saying, let me look at this again. Is there anything here?
Two New York district attorneys, Dan Bibb and Steve Sirocco, run a cold case unit to focus on unsolved murders.
Andrew Rosenzweig asked us if we would look into a missing persons case, and the missing person was Gail Katz Birnbaum.
He put a box on my desk, and it contained all the documents relating to the Birnbaum case.
There was an extremely important piece of information that was discovered a couple of months after Gail's disappearance. The investigators learned Robert Birnbaum was a pilot.
Whoa, guy's a pilot. It's just, you know, it's worth checking out the airports for that day.
They went out to local New Jersey airports to see if he had flown.
And sure enough, he took a plane out that day.
for almost 2 hours on the afternoon of July 7th, 1985, the day she disappeared. He left that detail out despite being pressed repeatedly to account for all of his time during the time after she disappeared. And it wasn't just an omission. It was, in our view, was a huge lie. In our opinion, Robert Birnbaum had something to hide. And that something had to do with why he flew that plane that day.
By the time police learn he piloted a plane the afternoon his wife disappeared, Bob Birnbaum stops talking to investigators.
Robert Birnbaum had retained an attorney, so they couldn't confront him with this information.
Authorities conduct forensic searches of his car and the plane. Both come up clean.
The Manhattan District Attorney's Office felt at that time there was not sufficient evidence to go forward.
Without evidence of a crime, Gail Birnbaum's case goes cold. Now, 14 years later, Bibb and Sirocco instruct their investigators to review every piece of evidence linked to the case, including the torso that washed up on Staten Island.
So then they asked for permission to exhume her body. And believe it or not, that was a hard one for me. But they talked me into it.
They decide to exhume the body because there is so much more advanced DNA testing that could be done on Gail's remains.
The results from the DNA test shock authorities and horrify the families.
They told me that it wasn't her body. So that my closure was gone. I was heartbroken again.
We needed something else. We needed more evidence.
Investigators tracked down more than 50 people who knew the couple, hoping to uncover a new lead. Stephen Sirocco speaks with Dr. Michael Stone, the psychiatrist Bob Birnbaum consulted after he allegedly tried to strangle Gail for smoking. Dr. Stone shares a startling fact with the DA.
Dr. Birnbaum's psychiatrist was so upset with a session that he had with Birnbaum that he was required ethically to send a letter to Gail to warn her that her life was in danger and that she should get out of the house.
Dr. Michael Stone was convinced that he was violent and would harm her and possibly kill her.
It was a damning assessment of Robert Birnbaum's mental health.
Sirocco and Bibb find a new witness, a woman who was romantically involved with Bob Birnbaum and moved into Birnbaum's apartment just a couple of months after Gail disappeared. She tells investigators a disturbing story about her former boyfriend.
Back in 1985, Roberta Karnofsky was uncooperative. She refused to be interviewed. We found her, and she's practicing anesthesiologist, I believe, in Charleston, South Carolina, and gave us information that nobody knew.
Roberta Karnofsky was living with Dr. Birnbaum. A phone call comes in around 2 or 3 in the morning, and it's from the police. And they said, "We think we found your wife."
Gail Katz Birnbaum vanishes without a trace on July 7, 1985. 2 months later, her husband, Dr. Bob Birnbaum, invites Roberta Karnofsky to move in with him.
police called Bob. It's sort of in the middle of the night, and there's Roberta lying next to him. He gets off the phone, and he says they think they found Gail.
Police tell Dr. Birnbaum she seems to be in like a state that she doesn't know who she is or where she is. And Dr. Karnofsky goes, "Do you want me to out of here?" She was ready to scoot, you know, his wife's coming back. He goes, no, it's not her.
That indicated that he knew it wasn't going to be her, because it couldn't be her, because she wasn't alive. And the reason why he knew that is because he had something to do with her demise.
After that conversation, Roberta begins to suspect that Bob may have killed his wife. She tells her girlfriend, and together they decide to go hunting for evidence.
He was a licensed pilot, and Roberta was aware that Bob was meticulous in his maintenance of a flight log. She said, well, let's find the flight log. And they began rummaging through the apartment.
They were playing like Nancy Drew. When he was at the hospital, they looked around and found the log.
And they turned to the page of July 7th, 1985, the day she disappeared. And the entry for that day had been altered to another day.
He changed the date on the flight log from 7/7 to 8/7.
While investigators knew that Bob Birnbaum flew a plane the day his wife vanished, this is the first evidence to suggest an intentional cover-up.
He was trying to hide the fact he had flown on the day his wife disappeared.
A secret trip, a doctored flight log, and a missing wife. For the district attorneys, it all points to one inevitable conclusion.
They had a violent argument, and he strangled her. He cut her up in the apartment.
The theory was that he cut her up in the bathtub, which would make it easier to transport body parts. But when they were able to get into that apartment after he moved out and did a complete forensic search with luminol, they found nothing. Not a trace.
As to whether there were ever any forensics, blood, hair, tissue, there was never anything forensically valuable that could be presented to a jury. Never. Nothing.
Still, investigators are convinced that Bob Birnbaum killed his wife and disposed of her body.
I believe he packed his wife up in a bag, walked out the back door of that building, walked 2 blocks to where his car was parked, put her in the trunk of the car, drove out to West Orange, New Jersey, loaded her into a plane, and flew her out over the Atlantic Ocean and dumped her out.
It seemed entirely implausible. Just, how could you physically do this? Drag this body around the Upper East Side and then the airport and not be seen by anyone.
A pilot dumping a body out of a plane alone seems equally far-fetched. So investigators try to recreate it.
They did a reenactment on video, like taking, a plane up with the 110-pound bag of sand, because Gail was 107 pounds, and then show that you could open the door and throw it out.
It was clear that not only was it possible, it was easy.
On December 6th, 1999, 14 years after Gail Birnbaum disappeared, the Manhattan District Attorney charges Dr. Bob Birnbaum with murder.
In Manhattan, the plastic surgeon from North Dakota is charged with murder.
They charged him with second-degree murder,
The case was entirely circumstantial, but we had spent the time and we were convinced we could get a murder conviction.
So when they say circumstantial case, whoa, highly circumstantial. And he pled not guilty.
At first, when I found out that they indicted Bob, I was in shock. I had this sense of relief. Finally.
The trial could begin sometime in the fall. In the meantime, Robert Birnbaum's living in New Jersey with his parents, who are both physicians, as part of the bond conditions. His wife, Janet, who is now studying law, lives in this house in Grand Forks, North Dakota, with the couple's first child. But she's always at her husband's side in court.
I think a lot of people were shocked, including his poor wife's family, when they heard Robert Birnbaum was being dragged back to New York City to face murder charges. The nice surgeon next door who operates on little children. Wow.
Gail Katz Birnbaum disappeared 14 years earlier without a trace. The New York City District Attorney has charged her husband, Dr. Bob Birnbaum, with murder. Now, they have to prove it to 12 jurors.
We realized that this was probably going to be the toughest case we ever tried. I certainly was concerned that there was not a body. When we began to investigate this case, there had never been homicide prosecution in New York without a body.
The thought that they were going to trial without really any forensics seemed like such a long shot.
Dr. Bob Birnbaum's trial for murder begins. The prosecution lays out their case.
The narrative was of a completely dysfunctional, sometimes violent marriage where we had a husband who hated his wife.
They had a very simple theory of the case. Gail finally decides she's had enough. She tells him she's leaving him, and he murders her.
The DA calls more than 20 witnesses. Prosecutors portray Birnbaum as a skilled surgeon more than capable of dismembering a body.
The medical examiner said that a plastic surgeon could cut up a body like a chef could cut up a chicken. It would take a matter of 10 minutes.
In addition to showing the jury the doctored flight log, the DAs screen the video recreation of a sandbag being dumped from the plane.
It was the end of the prosecution's case, and it was powerful stuff. We've never heard Bob Birnbaum's story from Bob Birnbaum. If I'm fighting for my life, somebody accuses me of murder, wild horses couldn't get me off that stand.
The defense calls only one witness, Joel Davis, the man who in 1985 reported that he saw Gail Katz Birnbaum on the same day the prosecution claims she was murdered.
He said that he had seen Gail alive on July 7th in the company of another woman in a bagel shop.
It almost comes down to anatomy. Gail Katz Birnbaum was very small, very petite. And Joel Davis describes her as statuesque, buxom.
We actually had a photo introduced of Gail in a bathing suit.
And there were audible groans coming from the jury box. He admits that he has described someone completely different.
Joel Davis was the entirety of the defense case.
I don't think anybody except the prosecution thought he was going to get convicted without a scintilla of evidence. 15 years old.
I did not allow myself to hope that there could be a guilty verdict. They said guilty, and I truly thought that my ears deceived me.
The verdict was guilty of murder in the second degree. Judge Snyder gave him 20 to life. He's still in jail to this day.
One disturbing question remains. Could Gail Katz-Birnbaum's death have been prevented? She reported Bob Birnbaum's domestic abuse a year and a half before she disappeared.
You have to wonder, back in 1985, had she had a couple cops who said, whoa, this is not good, who knows what would have happened? She could be alive today.
The most dangerous time in a domestic violence marriage is when the woman makes the decision to leave.
That's the irony. It's when the woman gains her strength that she's in the most danger.
And my sister's story proves that.
I think about Gail all the time, and I still get emotional about it. I miss her, even all these years later. I still think I see her sometimes, especially when I was living in Manhattan. I'd be on a bus, and I'd see somebody walking on the sidewalk, and I'd do a double take. I would think it was Gail.
I miss the person that I was supposed to grow old with. The loss is incomprehensible.